Okay, are we live? We're welcome to the Trending Podcast. Studio audience.
That's his radio voice.
Is very happy. Oh, we've got a raucous applause. I am here with two good friends and two great pastors, AJ Thomas and Mike Miller. Guys, where are you from?
Deepwater Church, Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Yep, and Mike?
Novachurch in Halifax.
These guys have become, I've known AJ for a number of years and Mike just in the last couple years, and just become good friends, and it's a real privilege to have you guys here to help us kind of continue our journey in the Trending series and on our podcast, and so it's a real privilege to have you here. We've done something over the last couple episodes of the podcast with our different hosts and stuff. We've asked the question, who is your celebrity lookalike? And so Pastor Andy on staff is Drew Carey, apparently. And David is Tom Brady. I've been told DiCaprio. I think that's generous.
I think that is generous.
Yeah, I think so.
I think someone was looking for a raise or a promotion.
They might have been.
Something.
They might have been. But who's your celebrity lookalike? Who you been told?
Back in the day, especially Chris Farley, I'd get that a lot.
Yeah. You had the like the mushroom cut too,
I had
right?
the hair.
You had the
I
blonde.
had the whole
And you
thing.
had the van down by the river, too.
It was not an unfair comparison. It was not an unfair comparison. And actually, I could. There's a whole thing about how Chris Farley died at 33 and Jesus died at 33, and Jesus is who I'm trying to be like, and Chris Farley's who I'm trying not to be like. Because I think my default is probably to be more like Chris Farley than it is to be like Jesus.
Working on the Jesus thing.
But yeah, that would be my celebrity lookalike.
I'm glad, just for the record, you made it past 33.
Thank you.
So yeah, it's good.
And
It's
you're
good
not
to-
hooked on drugs.
It's good to have you here.
I'm hoping to.
You're not Jesus.
To make it for quite a while.
But you're not Chris Farley.
Exactly.
So,
that's the tension I live in.
We'll take it.
On a scale of Jesus to Chris Farley.
Where are you? Are you more Jesus or Farley? Actually, Farley was a Catholic.
Yeah,
Like, he
devout
was a
Catholic.
pretty
Went
devout,
to mass every week.
You know, he's definitely addicted
definitely
to
had
drugs.
mass,
But
yeah.
Yep.
But I'm hoping. I think he's in heaven. Got all figured out now.
Well, as a Catholic, someone's still lighting candles to try to get him into heaven.
That might be it.
But
Maybe
eventually.
he's in purgatory.
When
here.
we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, it'll come Farley out of purgatory finally. Good to
Yes. For those of our listeners who are new believers, purgatory.
Try deep water on Sundays.
Yeah. We'll leave you 10 times more confused than you came.
That's right.
Yeah. And then, Mike, who you been told?
Once, Johnny Knoxville.
Oh, man.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
And then I'm going to date myself with this one, but Freddie Prinze Jr. on a flight. Someone
Nice.
thought I was Freddie Prinze Jr., but
Wow.
Teenage heartthrob.
I was not in first class, so no, I wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
Freddie Prinze would have fallen pretty far to be back in coach.
Yes. Yes, he would.
Which I
So
don't
where
know-
he is today, actually.
Yeah, I don't know what Freddie's up to these days.
He's lost in coach somewhere.
Yeah. Well, it's super nice to have you guys. So we've been talking about a bunch of things. There's a few topics we haven't covered yet. So, just to let you guys, bring you up to speed, we're doing this series called Trending, just looking at like the different topics that are facing the average believer that we just felt like we should talk about. So like the first week we talked about identity and gender. We talked about sexuality. We talked about politics, equality, justice, just all the stuff that's kind of right in front of you. And then this podcast is going to cover the last few topics. So we still have yet to talk in podcast form about substances. We talked about discouragement and suicide, depression, despair, just that whole, mental illness continuum. And then just fighting discouragement. We all do that. And then technology, life in the digital age. So I love to crack these conversations over. One of the things we've found is this format has actually helped us answer a lot more questions. I don't know, you guys are both fantastic preachers, and sometimes when you do a sermon, you really can, it's more of a sniper rifle than it is a shotgun, and you're not able to answer all the questions. And I've felt in this series like I've actually, we just made fun of Deepwater for doing this. I've actually created more questions than answered them. Yeah. But my job from the preaching standpoint was just to kind of give a biblical framework, and then this has really been effective in us just being able to kind of kick conversations around. People have sent in questions, and it's been super helpful.
I'm excited for it.
Yeah, so let's get the ball rolling. Let's talk about substances.
Sure.
Let's talk about
Yes, please.
You know, the reason we
More Lord.
Yeah, the reason we decided to even cover this was, you know, we have a church of people who come from a variety of backgrounds. Some of them have an upbringing like me in more of a religious, conservative culture where alcohol was forbidden. And then we have a lot.
Don't drink, dance, or chew, or hang with those that do.
Yeah, in fact, I quoted that line in my sermon. Yeah, so that was in your Bible too. Yeah. Okay. So.
Yep.
But we have a ton of folks who either, you know, they're new to Christianity, which is amazing, or they come from a Christian tradition that alcohol wasn't an issue, and then you drop the whole cannabis thing on top of it, and that we had to have a conversation about it. Funny enough, I was in your guys' neck of the woods a week ago and preached at our Halifax campus about substances, and I got up and I said, you know, well, we need to talk about this because cannabis is legal now in Canada, and somebody like all but just got up and slow clapped, you know, and I was like, boy, we got a lot to talk about. So, so let me lob some questions that came in no particular order. Here's this one's great. So some churches, let's just get substances going. Some churches and denominations condone the use of alcohol. So some, like I just said, some traditions like no, never, while others do not. Why is the church not in alignment on this subject, and what is right? Who's right?
It's a great question. You want to do it, Mike?
You lead it up, and then I'll clean it up.
I think the thing that, any church that's looking to talk about what the Bible teaches is going to be in agreement that being drunk is a bad plan.
Right.
And you don't have to have very much wisdom, frankly, to see that, you know, very few situations in life are fixed by being drunk. Generally, people make worse decisions, do stupid stuff. Some stuff just stupid, and some stuff stupid and sinful. But it's not a great way to go. And so I think, although there may be some traditions where they don't talk about it as much or speak against drunkenness as much, I think anyone who's kind of trying to follow the teaching of Scripture would have to agree on that. So then when it comes down to kind of the idea of responsible consumption,
right,
or social drinking, that kind of thing, like not drinking to get drunk, but having a beer while you watch the game or having some wine with a meal. Where different churches land on that is greatly influenced by kind of the history of those denominations, where their roots were.
Right.
I know for the denominational family that our church is a part of, a lot of our early days were in these frontier towns, kind of hard living towns where, alcohol consumption was a thing you did to blow your family's paycheck at the bar after you got done your shift at the mine or whatever, and it was just heavily detrimental to families. There wasn't any concept in those areas of, a fine glass of wine,
like drinking responsibly.
Yeah, it just wasn't a thing. It wasn't even on the radar. And so that tradition tends to have a much more staunch stance against alcohol, whereas in other places, other traditions, or in other areas of the world, Europe and that sort of thing, where there is that some places have more of a tradition and an idea of a cultural concept of socially responsible drinking. It's a more acceptable thing. And so for me, that the stance on that comes down not so much to a question of what is out and out sin versus what is acceptable, but more about what is wise and what is helpful.
That's good.
Right.
And so I know for me personally, I'm terrible at moderation.
Right.
I often say I can't do chocolate chip cookies in moderation. What are the odds I can do alcohol in moderation? And so
or special cookies.
Brownies. The brownies and cookies you can buy now.
We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that next. But so for me, it makes sense to be kind of a teetotaler as a kind of wisdom thing,
right?
And as a for myself, I wouldn't trust myself to know where that line is.
So denominations have put that down from not necessarily there's a biblical reason for that, but a wisdom reason as to, hey, this is leading us to bad places. So for our family, we're gonna not do that at all.
And it helps keep us away. Sorry, it helps keep us away from, like, it's kind of where's the cliff, but where do you put the fence, right? And so If you come from a tradition where people like to climb the fence and jump on it, then you want that fence a little further away from the cliff, which was that kind of Wild West frontier town thing. Whereas if you are from a place where people know how to climb a fence and just sit and enjoy the view, maybe it makes sense, or it can be.
Whenever you see a rule in a church, because someone was stupid once. Right. Like if you ever see a sign that says no coffee in the sanctuary, it's because someone took coffee in and one day they spilled it on the keyboard. Right. And then there was a sign on the door. So we have to preach the Bible. This is what we were guilty of years ago as missionaries. We'd go into a country and another culture, and we would try to give them our culture, not the gospel. Right. So we have to preach the gospel, but then you live your convictions, and we have to understand the difference. It's not wrong to have a beer. Biblically, It's not wrong to have a beer. Right. But where's that line of drunk, depending on how hungry you are, how much you weigh, what kind of day you had? Is 3 beers holy and 4 beers sin? For me, the challenge too is culture is fading away. Meaning, before it was England was a different culture than Brazil, but now because of the internet and technology, the Harlem Shake trended in Bogota, and it trended in Halifax, and it trended in Moscow. Right. So now in live time, we're seeing in the church context leaders that we respect and love or admire, and in their behind-the-scenes stories, they're having a pint. And all of a sudden, because we identify with their teaching, their style, their culture, we start absorbing their culture. So we have to know where we are. And I think the bigger question is, I think there's this thing of leadership. We think leadership is freedom. Leadership is actually the opposite of freedom. The present day president of the United States would not be a good example. But let me go back to the previous one, Obama. If he took a day off and went golfing, he would have got crucified over that because of problems going on all over the world. If I took a day off and went golfing, no one's going to cause a problem. He has more power and more leadership than I do. Right. I think we have to ask the question is what's beneficial? Yeah. Paul said it's not what's sinful, it's what's beneficial. Yeah. Is it helpful? And, my father came out of he was an alcoholic. My grandfather was an alcoholic. And I say it this way that, because I've seen my generation kind of like, hey, we're free to do what we want. Is why would it be that my personal conviction, this is not gospel. Gospel is drunk is a sin. For me, why would it be the bondage that God freed my father from would be the freedom he took me into? Right. So for me, that's good. And what you do as leaders in moderation, your followers will do in access. And, I might say a certain curse word, but my kids will go further. If I watch a certain level of movie and humor, they'll go further. If I'm having, for me personally, this is my conviction, if I'm having a glass of wine on my anniversary, my kids might be wanting to have a beer with their buddies when they're old enough on wing night. Right. So for me, it's mindful of the end game. It's bigger than what my preference is. Yeah. It's what am I? Because what you reward, you reproduce. Yes. That's my mindset.
So we in my sermon, I kind of laid it out this exact same way you guys are saying. I said, okay, let's look at the Bible first, and the Bible does not say alcohol in and of itself, or cannabis for that matter, is wrong. It just says intoxication is wrong. But then there's the question of, what's good? Is it bad? Is a JV level, entry level Christian question to ask. Is it good? Is a better question. That's where Paul's getting not just because you're loud doesn't mean it's beneficial. Mm-hmm. So I kind of worked on this framework for our people. I said, here's kind of a discerning path that you can take for figuring out if something's going to be good or not. Is it good for me? So it's a wisdom question, right? Like hey, when I get drunk, do good things happen? Is it good?
I've got a friend who always says, I've never met anyone who said my life was going terrible, but then I started drinking. Right? Like it's never the turnaround point in anyone's life.
And then I met Jack Daniels.
But I got hammered. Yeah. And just everything changed. And life got better.
Yeah. So there's that one. And I think probably in the church, more people need to just be honest with that one even. Like, it's just probably not been good for you. But there are some people that they can check that off and say, I can control it. I never get drunk ever. I just enjoy beer. I craft my own, Like, I think there are people that can obviously check that off and keep going. Then the second question was, it's not just one responsibility as a Christian is to ask, is it good for me? The other one is it good for you? Yeah. Like, is it good for others? Like, because I can't be a source of weakness for you. Like, if you're my brother and you have an alcohol problem, it's a sin for me to expose you to that and make your struggle harder.
Absolutely.
Right? So that was the second question. Then the third one I said was, is it God's for me? Sometimes God will just ask to have something, even though it's not sin or not. Yep. He'll just say, I want that from you. But this is what I want to ask you guys. is I think where the church has gone into trouble has been taking a standard, because that's what you were talking about, was a leader or someone who's following Jesus even. As you mature in that, he's gonna set standards on you. He's gonna call you to higher standards, whether it's for how you're leading your family, what's good for you. He's gonna place standards there, and he wants to fill those with his own blessing and all that. I think the problem that we've seen in the church, even with this and in many other things, is when we take a standard that was discerned personally, again, your conviction, use that word. You take a standard and you apply it to someone else, right? So it's like the missionaries coming and bringing a cultural standard to people in Africa who don't have that culture. I think that's probably what's been hard for the average person to maybe navigate, has been maybe handing the law without the revelation.
Well, rules without relationship always breed rebellion.
Yeah.
And so that's why the relationship is the why. So like as a church, a pastor of a 14-month-old church in Halifax, people have different convictions. I'll use alcohol, for example, my team. And some of them you see on their Insta stories, glass of wine, having a beer, whatever. And we've wrestled with, is that right or wrong? And we go back to biblical. But then we've said, but if you're going to be a part of this church, when you lead something, when you put that hat on, you're going to lead a small group. You're going to go out as a ministry group. You're going to, if it puts under the umbrella of Nova, we're alcohol free in that event. And then I start unpacking the why. For example, you don't know someone in your small group who's actually recovering from being an alcoholic. You don't know. And I try to give them not just the rule, but the relationship. I always say, put a face on your fight. And the problem is sometimes with organized denominations is we lose the face in the fight and all we get is the rule with the relationship. So that's why we've got to navigate this as emerging leaders, young leaders, and take the time to put a face on it. So the second I put my father's face on it with alcohol, people are like, oh, okay, so I understand why it's personal to you.
Right.
And I think we have to it always starts and ends with people. And that's why organizations, we've got to always fight to make it personal and put a face on our fights.
Yeah, that's huge.
I think too with the, I guess what I love about the kind of that filter that you set up, Brent, is so often I think we have been guilty of handing down the conclusion without the process, right?
Exactly.
And it's kind of, I go back to my grade school days, right, where the teacher was always like, show your work, don't just tell me what the answer is, show your work.
Yes.
And so if you just tell someone this is wrong and you don't explain why, or this is unhelpful and you don't explain why, or this is unwise, or this is a standard we hold leaders to, or whatever, and you don't show that work, it feels incredibly arbitrary.
Yes.
And when someone can't kind of instantly see the reason behind it, then that arbitrariness kind of breeds contempt, right? It's like, well, that's stupid. That's just a rule you made.
And rebellion.
Yeah. And it also, there's nothing transferable about it, right? And so, I mean, I had a conversation with a friend of mine from a denominational background that tends to historically have a less than healthy relationship with alcohol. And he was asking, like, when the whole cannabis legalization thing came, he's like, what are you guys going to do with that? And I was like, for us, it's very simple. Like, it's just alcohol again. Yeah. All right. But because we kind of have that thought process and have that history and we know how to explain the issues with intoxication, then it's, to a certain extent, I'm not saying they're the same substance, but I mean, to a certain extent,
it's kind of the same framework.
Yeah. And I think when we teach our people those frameworks or those filters, when we walk them through the kind of those steps and the things we need to be thinking about and the consideration of other people, I mean, that's huge for me. CR is a big thing. Celebrate Recovery is a big thing in our church. And like, the last thing I want is somebody who's in recovery in CR seeing something in my life that they could take way out of context and completely misconstrue, but still use as an excuse for, well, I can have a beer because AJ can have a beer or whatever, right? And I do think that's part of that. Like, I'm not saying everyone needs to be that way, but for me in leadership, I feel like that's where I need to be.
It's being Christ-like, right? To do that.
But when you show people that process, then they not only can go, oh, there's where the conclusion comes from, but then they can do that in other things in their life.
That's why it's good I like to show your work. There needs to be room for people to decide for themselves. There's this old belief that good Christians don't ask questions. Great Christians ask questions. That's why. And if you haven't subscribed to this podcast, you need to. You guys were trending nationally. You guys, I think last time I looked, was like top 20 in the nation because it's opening up. This would have been unheard of 10 years ago in my context. So I remember, here's my story. I grew up like having a beer, because again, my father's story, my mother was depressed. She almost killed me and my sister and herself. Wow. Suicide, murder. My dad, because of his alcoholism, this whole story. Having a beer was the same level as like killing kittens. Actually, I don't even like kittens, so that's not fair. It was like the worst sin ever. And I'm sitting in England with a church, working for a summer at 19, and I'm sitting with the most godly men and women that fear God, love God, passionate with the church, and they're having a board meeting, having a pint.
Yes.
And I remember wrestling with, I want to be like these people. I can feel the God cravings in them.
Yep.
But my mind was having this war of, but they're having beer in their hand.
They can't love Jesus.
So then I remember I went to this pub crawl with them because they're watching soccer, and I remember I had my pint, a first pint. And I'm sitting there, and I had one pint. I didn't understand anything about alcohol. I was 20 years of age, and I'm walking down the street, and I was asking myself, we're talking about revival at the time, the Toronto Blessing. And I remember saying, am I drunk right now? I don't know if I'm drunk. And I remember a true story, walking down Plymouth, England, cobblestone streets where the Mayflower came to the New World, and I walked over in the middle of a conversation to the curb and tried to walk the curb. I was completely fine. But I remember wrestling with, these people love God, but I didn't understand. I had to wrestle with it. At the end of it, I came through with my own beliefs. My parents framed it. But we have to wrestle with these things. That's why it has to be a conversation.
Yeah. And I don't drink. One, because I'm affiliated with the denomination. I said I wouldn't. They put that on me, and I agreed to it. So out of just honor to that and God, I don't. But even if that weren't the case, my own personal conviction, because of being in a leadership role, I'm just not going to.
Yep.
However, I have many pastor friends and people from other churches and people in our own church community that drink responsibly, and they love Jesus.
Yeah.
But as a religious kid, like same thing. Yeah. I had a journey to make there too, because I was just taught that's the devil, and that's just not a substance is an inanimate object. There's implications with it, but it's not what it is. It's why you use it, like why you're going to it and how. I think is the question you have to ask.
That's another thing I think is super helpful in this conversation too, for people who maybe have a hard time even with the why is it bad to get drunk thing, or why is it maybe is there any good reason I shouldn't be getting high or whatever else. I only drink at home, or I'm not driving. I mean, like even those kind of things, to try to argue that away is to kind of ask that, why do you feel the need to do this? Like, right. What is this?
What's the motive?
Yeah, what's this replacing in you, or what's this providing for you? What's the problem that you're solving with this? Because generally there's a more God-oriented solution to whatever we're trying to address with those substances.
And I think it goes beyond even things like alcohol and cannabis. It goes back to, it's one thing to do something. It's nothing to lean on something.
Right.
So we can cross this over into entertainment,
food.
We can take it into relationships, food. We can do it into escapism. Like some people, if you're I always say, don't escape your life, live your life. But we have. I know me and AJ have a friend in our area has since passed, but alcohol became his escape to deal with stress.
Right.
And it wasn't because he was trying to prove something. It ended up becoming a coping skill, and eventually ended up where his life is gone and his ministry was broken. And it was a reminder going, be careful what you lean on, whether that be an entertainment, escapism. I'm always reminded going, because the Bible says trust in the Lord. And second you lean on something, you're trusting in it.
Yeah.
So
that's what I love about this filter thing that you're setting up for people too, because like that same filter for should I drink works for should I get high, but it also works for should I date this person? Yeah. Should I be friends with this person? Should I
play hockey 5 times a week?
Totally. Right. And it teaches people, like when we teach people that, it teaches them a skill set that then they can use in the million less obvious questions of life, as opposed to just going like, so I know that I shouldn't date a girl who drinks,
right?
But she could be, some sorceress or whatever otherwise. As long as she doesn't drink, we're good. It teaches you some of those filter things.
Yeah. Pastor Brent said this only applied for alcohol. That's amazing.
Ma'am, have you been drinking? No? All right, then. Pastor Brent approves.
Sorry, back to your seance. I said to ask that question. Yeah.
Can you tell me, is the spirit we're contacting sober right now? Because I got to think about that.
Was this spirit an alcoholic in a past life? Because... Can't do it.
What was their blood alcohol level when they died?
Yeah.
Can they? Is there a breathalyzer for ghosts?
Did they inhale?
In a funny way, though. In a funny way, that's what religion is.
Yeah.
That's what religion. I mean, we're joking and goofing off.
Oh, it's the what without the why.
Totally. It's like taking this filter and wrongly appropriating it as this kind of whole worldview.
Well, there's people that are religiously married. They eat at the same table and sleep in the same bed, but they're not married. And by law, they're married, but the why has left.
Right.
And that's why we need to wrestle with these questions. That's why Jesus didn't say, here's who I am. He said, who do you say that I am? Because he wants us to wrestle through this. And that's what this is. There's a bigger question than, give me a rule. How many beer is sin or holy, or how many? Yeah. It's a bigger question of what's in your heart, what's leading you, and what are you hungry for?
Jesus came to embody the law, right? It just takes the shape of a person, not like a platform or a system of rules. One of the last thing I said about it in my message was like, really at the end of the day, if you're going to a substance to replace the someone who is Jesus, that's when you're in trouble.
Yeah. Yep.
Now, something I would say to people who struggle with some of that stuff too, or who see this kind of rule or law or standard and don't understand behind it, is one of the things my dad taught me that's been super helpful for me. We grew up in a farming community.
Susstown,
born and raised.
Dairytown.
And I wasn't actually born there, but I was raised there. Yeah.
On the playgrounds
where I spent most of my days because there was nothing else to do. And one of the things he said,
tipping necks.
He said, never tear down a fence until you know why it was put up. Like never, if you were to take over a farm and you go, I don't see what the point of this fence is, don't tear it down until you know why it was put up. And so one of the things I would encourage maybe younger believers to do, I don't mean age younger, I mean newer to faith. If there's some of those standards that you go, I don't know why this is a thing, give the benefit of the doubt to the smart people who love Jesus, who went on before you, and assume that there is, a reason. Until you have proof otherwise, assume there's a good reason for it. You just don't understand the reason yet. Yeah. Again, take the issue of alcohol, far better to go 3 years in, I realized, I could have a beer with, while I watch the game or while I have some pizza, and that wasn't a big deal. And I missed on 3 years of beer, big deal. Yeah. Then to go, who cares, and wind up in way worse shape because you go whole hog with alcohol or with some other substance. And so it's hard. And I grew up in church around all those rules, but didn't always get the why. Right. And tend to have a real kind of questioning, cantankerous, cynical kind of mindset. And I remember the day that kind of penny dropped for me, is like, a bunch of people who really love Jesus and who were a lot like Jesus. Like, we're definitely holy. They had a lot of rules that I didn't understand why they had the rules, but even in their heart, I could see like there's holiness there. There's something legit there to go, I'm gonna let them kind of metaphorically at least have a chance to argue their side of the case before I go tearing down this fence that they built for me.
That's huge.
Yay!
That's huge wisdom, and props to your dad on both the punchy illustration and the cultural contextualization of saying that to you in Dairytown, no less. Like, see these fences, son? Yeah. Anyway,
don't tear them down till you know why someone built them.
It's really good, really good. I think from your generation, I know you guys are both a few years older than me, but I straddle the Gen X and the millennial line. You guys are Gen Xers.
Yeah.
I think from Gen X definitely into millennials, and now like Generation Z, there is not just a dismissal of fences that were put up, but almost a skepticism. Like you don't know anything. Like I know that really started to come into play with my generation because it was probably the first time in history, because of the way the internet came on the scene, and you all of a sudden had these kids who were more quickly averse into the digital world than their parents, that the natural order of parents passing down things just kind of got inverted, probably for the first time in history. Yeah. And I think that's what really kicked the millennial generation, that attitude of, well, you don't even know how to like right click on a mouse, so why are you telling me how to, I
think millennials kind of tend to take a certain pride in tearing down a fence too. Like it's seen as a good thing. Like
I
there
think it
shouldn't
comes
be fences.
from that. I think it really does.
And then I think the next generation behind them, the Ys or whatever,
the Zs.
There we go. Yeah, the Zs. I think they're coming to the point though, and I think this might be an opportunity for those who do ministry with them.
Agree.
They don't even know the fences were there in the first place, right? And so to say like, hey, there are people who live like this.
Yeah.
I remember the guy was not Generation Y or Z; he was X. But a guy who was fairly new to our church, fairly new to faith, went on a missions trip with a bunch of the guys from our church, and they're all laying awake in bed one night in the bunkhouse at this mission compound, talking about life and everything else. And as often happens when you got a bunch of guys in a room, especially a lot of them were single, they start talking about dating and romance and sex and most of these guys, good Christian boys, they're waiting until they're married, right? They're not sexually active. And I remember him saying, he goes, laying there, it was like I realized I was sitting in a room full of unicorns.
Or eunuchs, one or the other.
He said, I had heard of the concept.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize there were actually people who lived that way.
Yeah.
And I'm like I think he was kind of like no,
shocked.
but for real, you don't?
Really don't?
Yeah. And they were all like, no, man. That's not what God wants for me.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see a lot of that with Generation Z. Is it's going to be that like, oh, that's a thing? Living that way is a possibility. And in some ways, I think it's easier to start with people who are ambivalent to fences, just don't even know about them, than people who are hostile to them.
I think you guys, I love your opinion on this, but I do think that presents the church an awesome opportunity, because I do think like the Generation Z are the ones that are going to be the most hungry actually for someone put up a fence.
Well, you talked about
give
that.
Me some guidelines.
You talked about that inversion that happened.
Yeah.
With like how to right click.
Yeah.
And that's just the thing is I think that inversion happened, and we've got and even the tail end of Gen X was that way. But we kind of got this. We devalue the wisdom of the older generations, but because we have more knowledge. But we don't have more wisdom. Right. And I think people are going to finally wake up and go like,
value wisdom.
Being able to look something up on the internet does not tell you how to actually live life.
Think about this. The latest update was how to judge how much time you spend on this thing. Right. And there's a thing called screen time. So they're trying to get you off your phone. Whereas 7 years ago, I'm like, why would you limit this? We have the world at our fingertips. And now they're going, you know what? We need to go back to putting our phones down. One Republic has that song right now called Connection. Can I Get a Connection? It's like, put your phone down face to face. There's restaurants, cool restaurants saying, you can't open your phone in here. And 7 years ago, I'm like, what are you doing, man? You're cramping my freedom. The people that are living in that are going, we want to go back to board game cafes are coming. Why? Because we're going back and putting those fences back in. Yeah. It's amazing how it goes in full circle when you understand the why of it.
Yeah. Well, and there's no app for wisdom. There's no technology for wisdom. Like there's no, if your marriage is in trouble and you and your spouse are falling apart at the seams, that tech knowledge or that act, like you can read 1,000 books, but that you need some real life on life stuff, and you need some people generally, I think, in your life who can put fences in place for you. Right. Like if I've been in the place in my life before going, I am dumb enough. I'm the sheep. I can't also build the fences in certain parts of my life, in certain times, right? And so having some people who can just go like, no, just don't do this, even if you don't understand why yet.
So this is the church. So information is a travel agent. Churches are tour guides. And the difference with a travel agent is they'll book your flight and say, I hope you get there on time. But tour guide takes you along the way. But even this podcast, what it's saying is we're not going to give you information. We're going to wrestle it with you and take you through it and show you where we messed up and where we excelled and why we do the things we do. That's why you can't – I don't believe – we had this conversation earlier in another context. That's why online church is great information, but at some point you need someone to take you by your hand and be a tour guide in conversations outside of a stage, outside of a room, and go, here's how I do it. Yeah. And the way I live wasn't because of information, because of a face that walked me through it and said, here's where I messed up and here's where I excelled. Right. And because I respected them, I framed myself to that. So huge. That's why this is so important.
Huge. So one more question on substances, and because we didn't really hit this, the cannabis thing, although you put it into the same kind of framework, I agree on the intoxication thing. Do you guys have any opinion or data on The thing that I am not as averse in, and I did some research. I talked to some doctors, talked to a stoner friend, like trying to get a feel for is there a place for a believer to toke, recreationally?
Yeah.
Do you have any opinion on that?
Let me flip it a little bit. I'm not going to answer your question. I want to be a good politician, but here's my concern with it.
Can I deflect?
Is we're creating really weak adults. So the statistic came out that the same stress on young men going into battle in the Second World War, they did brainwaves, is the exact same level that young men going into high school are facing right now.
Wow.
So the brainwaves, it's the same level of stress. So what happens is there's what stressed me out at age 12 is the same stress I'm dealing with now at 43. But looking back, it wasn't the same situation, but it felt the same.
Right.
But I built coping skills. So when I delayed on that project, it was due, I never forget, it was a project on killer whales. And I was due the night before I had to do it, and there was no internet. It didn't exist. You had to go to the library and do you know your Dewey Decimal System? But we were a middle-class family. That? You don't even know. Google it. We had an encyclopedia. We were a rich middle-class family. And I remember I had to do a 3-page report on Bristol board, and the encyclopedia had half a page, and I couldn't cut it out. And I remember the stress I felt with of procrastination and all this. It's the same thing I'm dealing with a pastor with the church, but I learned a coping skill at 12 the next time. Something about cannabis, it lends it to escapism.
Yes.
It's all like the whole I can't even. I can't even.
Yeah.
It's I just got to go home. I just got to get high. I just got to. And what happens is I think we're delaying building muscle that we're going to need. So when you don't get that job, that girl walks out of your life, you don't get that promotion, you don't get your class schedule, and you go, I just need to escape for a minute and get high. All of a sudden you're going to be 40, and when your wife has that miscarriage or all of a sudden you lose your job, you won't have the muscle that you should have built at 17.
Yeah.
When you couldn't get into university, you had to go work for a year. That's my concern with this. Is it's delaying the growth. So we have the information, but not the muscle.
Which is actually the heart of God in your life, is to actually grow you. Yeah. Like the thing we said again. It doesn't say
you want to grow weed, but God wants to grow you.
Good. No, but it doesn't actually say in the scripture anything about marijuana. So we had to look at what's the Spirit's work in your life, and this is what Paul was getting at in Ephesians, where he said, "Don't get drunk on wine, but be filled with the Holy Spirit." The work of the Spirit in your life is to help you engage reality and enhance your perspective and perception.
Not numb and
and pot is really there to help you escape and evade, right? And so
I mean my take on that would be similar to my take on alcohol, basically being, if you sit on your couch in your basement, roll up a fatty and smoke it, are you going to hell? Probably not because of that.
Yeah.
I mean, might be, but probably not because of that.
That's not the...
But to me, that'd be the same thing as, and if I sit and drink a beer while I watch the game, I'd be in a pretty similar state. Although, there's really not that middle ground with weed between, there's no like, I toked, but I didn't get high kind of a thing. Or if you are doing that, you're probably doing something wrong.
The thing the doctors told me and my recreational pot user friend.
I thought you were going to say your dealer.
No, I don't have a dealer. He does, but I don't.
No high like the most high. Yes.
Just that there really isn't that social window that there is with alcohol. Like some alcohol, you're going to it for the exact same reason. Like you're taking a shot. Like I don't really know like Christians why you would take a shot, because really you were going for the you're not trying to taste it. You're opening your mouth and you're dumping it down your throat.
It's fast forward.
You're trying to get the effects, not the.
I mean, I think I've heard people make arguments, and they're not invalid. They're just inadequate. That you don't hear nearly as many stories about someone getting stoned and then going home and beating their wife, or those kind of things in terms of negative outcomes. But I do think all those same principles apply in terms of what are you trying to escape? Why are you leaning on this versus God? That kind of thing. I do think, and this isn't the question you asked, I do think it's a very different conversation when you're talking about legit medical,
100%,
right? I think that there's a place for that, and I have friends who, like, under a doctor's care, have been prescribed cannabis as medicine, who for them the smoking of it is more effective than some of the other modes of transmission or whatever. And to me,
they'll go to the same conversation as it's true that the number one, I think it was a couple years ago, was nighttime Advil for people that take the edge off so they could go to sleep at night, and they weren't in pain. It's the same thing. Like, you take Advil for pain. That's what it's there for.
Yeah.
And in this case, if you're in pain and this is actually treating something, it's different than escaping stress or your life.
Yeah, and as Christians, like, you can find some Christians that just don't do medicine.
Yeah.
Because that's lack of faith.
They don't live very long.
They don't.
But they do. They believe hard.
They do, but
time.
they're cranky.
God bless them.
Cranky, yes.
They don't. But yeah, and that's the totally.
I guess I just want to be careful when we say, like, is it okay to toke?
Yeah.
I mean, again, you couched it well, but say, like, if that is the delivery system that in cooperation with your doctor makes sense medically,
yes,
then I'm not here to tell you one way or the other.
I would encourage a believer to try to, if it's available, to find a different delivery system.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, like, you can get it in pill form, cream form, oil form.
I have friends who are on it medically, and they've said that, like, or I've got one friend in particular who, if it's like he's got the oils and some of those kind of things, but some days the symptoms that those are treating for him are strong enough that those don't touch it, and for some reason smoking it does. And again, it's one of those, I think you'd have to be in a pretty severe situation. This is a guy who had chronic pain issues for years and was on opioids for years and all this kind of stuff, right? And so for me, even like smoking's probably a worse way to take it, even for your health. Yeah. But it's one of those, at some points you're kind of bartering between, do I want a miserable life where I die of something at 85, or do I want to die at 78 and have had some sort of quality of life or whatever? But I don't think there's any reason. The
data on it as a medicine actually is growing. Like, I interviewed 2 Christian doctors. One of them is like just like really geeking out on like the possibilities of this plant for medicine. The other ones also agreed that there are some things that it truly is showing, like that it is a valid form of medication. He said, though, one thing that's not fair for it is people are running with this assumption that it's helping all kinds of things, and that's just not really true. It does help certain ailments, but not everything. All right.
I think I was just gonna say, I think the science on that will continue to
evolve. To
evolve, but I do think too, at the end of the day, like I was in a conversation with some people about this the other day, and somebody said, I think it's just a placebo effect, right? And I'm one of those. I'm like, hey,
if it works,
if rubbing that oil somewhere or whatever, like if that takes away the pain, who cares whether it's in your head or in your nerves?
Sure.
Like, to me, if it's a placebo, don't tell them.
Yeah.
Like, just let them go on being relieved of that symptom.
It'll be interesting, like, if we could have this sit down 20 years from now and just see socially and economically what the implications are, because we haven't actually lived in a country where that's.
Yeah. And when you talk medicines too, it's hilarious. Like, how often do you hear these like FDA regulated, made in a lab, whatever?
Right.
And they get pulled because it turns out they're killing people, right?
Yeah.
And so, science is not an exact science.
No, that's right. That's right.
And you kind of got to roll with what the best wisdom is at the time.
All right, so let's change gears. I want to talk about like depression, discouragement. We live in a day and age where people are more discouraged on a daily basis than ever. Even you kind of hit on that a little bit, Mike, just on measuring how people cope with stress and the things that stress people out at the same level that dudes who are running into trench warfare were feeling, you're feeling in high school. And that's more of a statement on not just like that the pressure shifted, but our ability to actually manage it. So we live in a time, like, where mental illness is huge. Depression is huge. Despair is huge. And even suicide as well. I think the suicide rates are higher than ever before, and it's happening in people younger than ever before. And so we just cracked that open at our church last weekend, just to have that discussion around it. How do we as believers understand the whole spectrum? And I know there are isolated conversations within that, and that mental illness and being suicidal aren't necessarily the same thing. There's a lot of questions that come with that. I want to get your guys' opinion, because I know you both have personal experience in some of these areas. I know, AJ, you've battled with mental illness yourself.
Yep.
And so let's start with mental illness. Let's start there, because that's something that's affecting a lot of people.
I always start with mental illness.
Yeah. So
every day.
Yeah. So but that's a fair question, because there's stigma associated with it. A lot. I think, although it's better than it used to be, I think there's more data and people understand it a little better. But how do you, as a man of faith, as a pastor, how do you understand the fact that you have, you struggle with this kind of fact of life?
Yeah.
Like, well, how does that work out in your life?
Yeah. Well, so quick background. I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder 3 and a bit years ago, and have been on meds for it ever since. And for me, kind of getting my head around that was, it wasn't a long process in terms of just being willing to go seek that treatment and stuff, because just stuff got so gray. It was one of those, like, I just, like, there's got to be something, right? Like, it kind of was a desperation thing. But one of the most helpful things for me, I should say there's two sides of depression, right? There's an emotional side, which, depending on who you talk to, emotions are ultimately all chemicals too, but there's a chemical component to it, right? So, like, if you talk to someone who, like, their, boyfriend just left them and their cat died and they lost their job, and they're going, man, I feel really down. Like, you're just sad because your life is terrible.
Sadness.
Right? Yeah. Like, and it might last for a while, but that's a different thing than clinical depression or anxiety or whatever else.
Do you think there's a lot of people that are caught up in what is sadness and calling it mental illness, or is that an assumption from a guy like me who doesn't actually have mental illness? And
maybe. But I think most people, like, very few people go to it. I think there's people who would say I'm depressed,
right?
Which it's one of those. There's like small d depression and capital, or there are people like, oh yeah, I'm so stressed out, which is a different thing than actually having like a chronic anxiety condition, that sort of thing. And there is a connection between the two in that, like, enough of those hits can push you to that place where there is a more clinical thing, right? In the same way that, you may have a sore knee, but not a bad knee. But if you get a sore knee enough times, eventually you'll have a bad knee. Right.
Okay.
And so
that's helpful.
Yeah. And so it's not, there's both, and it's not always either or. And I think there's an aspect of, it's studied that mental illness has a genetic component to it. Like, it's a thing that can be handed down.
Okay.
Like, if there's a history of mental illness in your family, it predisposes you. Doesn't guarantee anything, but it predisposes you more to that. At least that's, I'm not a medical doctor, but that's my understanding.
Are you a non-medical doctor? You said that like there's another doctor you were.
Well, I'm a doctor of
doctor of love. Yeah. You can't, these mics really want you, make you say that, don't you?
I'm actually scheduled to have a conversation with a guy coming up here soon whose actual name is Dr. Love.
Nice.
Like, he has a doctorate and his last name is Love.
He doesn't work in your children's ministry, I hope. Okay.
No, he works at our headquarters.
That's amazing. Yeah.
All right, I'm not with them.
Dr. Ed Love.
That's amazing.
Anyway, and so I do think there are people, particularly when people are young, like teenagers and stuff these days, I think there's almost a fashion around it. Around like, oh, I've got so much anxiety, and they really, it's sometimes it is, and sometimes it's
I'm
just
hearing 10-year-olds going, I'm stressed. When I was 12, I never even said that word in my life.
Right.
Well, you didn't even have the vocabulary to say
it was a really bad, tough day. But they're saying, like, I'm so stressed right now.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. I think there's a sense of, there is a trend side to it. But the people who are really wrestling with this, it's been a long, hard thing.
Yeah.
And it's usually something they've kind of, I don't want to say succumbed to, but you know what I mean? Like, it's not, no one in their right mind gets up going like, depressed, that's going to be my thing.
Right.
Or anxious. So I think for me, the thing, back to the original question, that was the most helpful in kind of getting my head around this as a condition I have that is not an indicator of my spiritual well-being.
Yeah.
Not that it doesn't have impact on my spiritual life. We're all in the same way. If you don't get enough sleep, that's going to have an impact on your spiritual life, right? But there's a guy who's a comedian, actually, not one I would recommend, but who also has struggled a lot with mental illness. And one of the things he said, if you have a problem with an organ in your body, say your liver, and there's a chemical that it doesn't make enough of, or that your body doesn't process right, like say insulin, you take something that makes that work right.
Right.
And he said, it's the same thing. There's a chemical, there's an organ in your body, it's your brain.
Right.
There's chemicals that it doesn't either make enough of or process correctly.
Yeah.
Serotonin, dopamine, those kind of things. And you can have a condition where you need to take something
to
help make that chemical process happen. And so for me, I talked about this at my church once, and I said, I view being a Christian with mental illness the same way I view being a Christian with any other illness. Right. Could God heal me from this? Absolutely. Sure. Would I love him to? Yes, I would. Do I ever pray about it? Yes, I do. Yeah. In the meantime, God always takes me to Paul, where he talks about, I have this thorn in the flesh and I beg God to take it away. And he just keeps saying, no, you're going to be weak. Yeah. And I'm going to be sufficient. And that's how it's going to go. Right. And so for me, I feel like, at least in this season of my life, and I would love the Lord to decide it's time for a new season. But for this last 3 years, it's been a lot about learning how his grace is sufficient in my weakness, as opposed to him deciding to restore me to full health and strength in that area. Yeah. That's super helpful. You said something too, because I did a series on worry back in the spring of this year. And I was asking you some stuff because again, I don't have mental illness. I don't struggle with depression. I have bad days just like everybody else, but then it moves on. So I was trying to ask you, help me understand, like the role of medication. And you were saying something about how it's kind of like it doesn't fix the problem for you. It gives you the ability to navigate. Totally. Yeah.
You use the light illustration.
The light.
It turns the lights on.
Yeah. It doesn't clean the room, but it turns the light on.
Yeah.
Or another kind of way I've heard it said is it doesn't necessarily pull you out of the ocean. Right. But it puts a life preserver around you that keeps you from going all the way under.
Right. Yeah.
And so even for some people whose depression, and I know way more about depression. I've never had an issue with anxiety. I don't worry. I'm not I never am afraid. I don't understand how people have both. Honestly, I'm not saying they can't, but just I'm like, how are you depressed and anxious?
Yeah, depressed almost lends itself to lethargy.
Exactly. Yeah. When I'm depressed, I don't care about anything. Right. I'm not worried about. I'm not even worried about bathing when it's at its worst, let alone, a comet hitting the planet or whatever, right? But yeah, when you've had, whatever, the hits just keep on coming, or you've been, my father had issues with stress and anxiety due to work stuff. And sometimes those natural causes that aren't based on a genetic predisposition, again, kind of beat you down to that. I don't have a sore knee, I have a bad knee thing. And sometimes even short-term meds are what's necessary, for you to even be functional enough to get therapy or to go to counseling or whatever to help you kind of out of that. And so, for me, I think, I often joke that about half of my job these days as a pastor is just telling people to take their meds. We have so many people in our church who struggle with this stuff, who and I'll see people and they're like, whatever, I don't want to be on my meds, right? I was like, dude, take your meds and go to counseling and talk to people and pray about it. But
it's not and it doesn't take any credit from the greatness and glory of God to celebrate healing through medicine. One of the things that's helped me, because we have people, some of our most faith-filled people at our church that have really pressed us forward, even in praying for miracles and seeing breakthroughs and stuff. And we've seen actual physical healing. Yeah. Have been actual physicians. We have some of those godly people here that are actual doctors who both can pray for supernatural healing, but also see the value of, part of God's grace in your life being sufficient is that he gave some doctor somewhere the wisdom to be able to put together a medicine that can actually help your neurons fire the way it needs to, right?
Absolutely. Well, and I think too this, I pick up a lot of times. I think the church, broadly, I'm not talking about any specific, I think the church is doing a better job of understanding that there is a very physiological component to mental illness. Right. It's not just emotional. In the sense of it's just a feeling and just power through it.
Just suck it up.
Yeah. Come on,
and the
man.
thing is, this is what I always tell people too. People say, well, why don't you just, right? When someone's mentally ill. And what I try to tell people is when you're mentally ill, that's what's broken in you. Right. Is your why don't you just.
That's huge.
It's not I want to sit here or I want to not do this or I want to, that thing that you tap into to just go mind over matter, right? Our mind is messed up matterly. You know what I mean? Right. And so I think the church is starting to get get that figured out. But I think when in our theology, we need to, if we understand it as a physiological thing, then we also have to treat it the way we treat other physiological things, right? And so if someone in your church is diagnosed with cancer, you'll pray for them, but you don't tell them to skip chemo.
Right.
And if somebody in your church has arthritis, you pray for them,
Right.
But you don't tell them to stop taking their Tylenol or whatever, right? And do you believe God could heal that? Absolutely. And have you seen it? Yep. Probably, yeah.
Yep.
But you don't just default to either you're like, and you wouldn't look at that person and go, man, what a bad Christian with that arthritis, eh?
Like you have little faith.
Yeah. You never go like, man, really? You got diabetes? Like, is everything okay with you and Jesus?
Right.
You know, like it's and so I think we need to start seeing it a little more that way. Yeah. But in the same way that, you know, with a lot of health conditions, there are things you can do to help and change and improve. And, you know, I think it's not a surrender to it. It's not like just mental illness happens. There's no hope, blah, blah, blah. But it's also, come at it from every angle you can come at it, and be okay with the thought that some people, that's just going to be part of their deal.
Yeah. So kind of the day-to-day, I think that's super helpful for the day-to-day Christian who's just, they're in the battle. They're in the fight for that. Yeah. There are situations, and many of us have been affected. I know you have, Mike, especially with someone that used to be in your youth group, that, you know, you battle with mental illness. And there are situations where Christians end up taking their own lives. Yeah. And I think it's important we talk about that, because all kinds of questions kind of come to mind, right? Especially for people who don't battle with mental illness at all, so don't understand even how you can get in that kind of frame of mind. You know, Mike, what's your, you know, just let's lob the, you know, the suicide conversation out on the table. Like, how do you process as a believer? You know, we obviously know thou shalt not murder. Yep. We all obviously know as a Christian, like all of us can deduce you don't do that. Like, it's very, very simple. So how do we process as believers the fact that there are people who love Jesus that have done that?
The first thing to be transparent is I don't know. And I think it's okay to say, I think we want people to be authentic. And I think it's one of these things we're walking through and working through and struggling with. I think for me, you don't know someone's, you know, the whole thing of don't judge my journey is kind of a hashtag. Don't judge my journey.
Right.
You don't know where someone's at. And that's why, you know, God looks at the heart. So it's not the outward appearance. Even looking at, was it David with Jesse's, you know, but heart. So there's that, you know, faith is a private thing that we live publicly. So we don't know where someone's at. I can't help but go to, and it's not just because, like, man, this person committed suicide, I love them, so they're in heaven.
Right.
But I do believe the reason of the age of accountability.
Sure.
You know, in children, you know, a child dies hit by a car at 2, but, you know, they didn't confess their faith and baptized and living a life of discipleship and memorizing scripture. Okay, are they in heaven? I do think there's something with mental illness or, deep depression where they're not in their right mind. Yeah. And I do believe there's a grace there.
I do too.
And I don't understand it in fully, but I do believe that, you know, when I was growing up, the argument was, you know, if no one's ever heard there is a Jesus, you know, indigenous tribe in the middle of this country, and they die, they never had a chance to accept Jesus. That whole argument, did they go to heaven or not? I believe there's something about, you know, what you're accountable for, what you know you're accountable for.
Right.
Information's power.
Yeah.
And I believe at some point, if you're not in your right mind, I do believe the goodness of God. You got to go back to God's character. And the situation I'm thinking about of someone in my life, it's the goodness. I know they love God. They were angry at God, but I know they loved God. They believed, you know, they confessed with their mouth and believed in their heart that he is Lord. They had a hard time following his direction or even maybe hearing it, but they believed it.
And that's the qualification for heaven.
Yeah.
Right? That's it. It's not the life you live.
Yep. Yeah. And for me, I believe there's a whole thing of you're not in your right mind to be able to make a choice. And then I also believe it's the whole, at the end of the day, you don't know where they are in their journey.
Right.
They know. So I have more questions than answers, but I do believe there's a grace of God's character based with, you know, not in the right mind to be able to make a choice. The great thing about faith is it is a choice. That's the freedom. Choice is the greatest freedom we have.
Yeah.
And then we're slave to those choices. I choose to step out on my wife or be faithful to my wife.
Right.
And if your choice is broken, your ability to make sane choices, I believe there's a grace there.
I do too. I think the thing that gets hard for people is like, but you're a Christian. Like, you're supposed to know better. And it's like, we probably look at that differently than other sins, right? And it's like, I was thinking about this. I didn't talk about my sermon because I chose with the sermon I wanted to just give people the equipment to deal with discouragement. So I didn't really talk about mental illness or suicide, really. I just set that up as what do we say to help us not get there? But I was thinking about this, like for suicide, if I go home tonight and I get in a fight with my wife and I'm just being a jerk. Like I'm not being the husband that I know the scripture commands me to be. I'm being selfish and self-absorbed and just a child. And I walk out of the house and I slam the door and I get in my car and I drive off and it's snowing outside and I slip on a turn and go into an SMT and I'm done. Yeah. I died in sin. Mm-hmm. Like I died acting in a sinful state, making stupid decisions, being entirely selfish in a moment of weakness. I don't think that takes me out of heaven. I confess my sins, I put my faith in Jesus. That's entry into heaven. I think the same thing can be applied for the believer who takes their life. Yeah. We would all say you're being entirely selfish. It's a moment of weakness where you clearly aren't in your right mind. You aren't thinking clearly or what honors God or other people. I think that kind of would transfer in that scenario that like, I don't think God's going to judge your eternity because of one moment of weakness.
And I do want to say this, and I know we're kind of maybe jumping ahead, maybe want to come back to where we are in the point. I do want to jump. There is something so spiritual about suicide.
Oh,
And I think it was 1774, there was this book, I heard a friend preach on this, and I just thought it was brilliant and there's a thing called the Werther effect now. There was a story about, I think it was called like the young love of Werther, about the story of a young man who lost his girlfriend. It was 1774, this novel, and because of that, he shot himself with a pistol. And suicide rates started escalating in the States. People started reading this book. In 1774, they banned the book. There is something about copycat. It's proven that whether it be Anthony Bourdain or is it Linkin Park and suicide,
Kate Spade, it was all like in a matter of weeks.
It spikes. Yeah. And I believe what you reward, you reproduce. Mm-hmm. And reward isn't just it's whatever you give time to. And there are people that are struggling and they'll attach to something going, I feel enough of that. And this line, I talked about it Sunday, said, don't make a permanent decision on a temporary problem.
Yes.
That's why I think part of our job as a church is to preach seasons and hope.
Yeah.
Going, like, I go back to Judas going, if you just hung on a little bit.
Yeah.
And the whole thing of anything, whether you walk out of your marriage or take your own life or quit a job, is don't make a permanent decision on a short-term problem.
Yeah.
And that's part of I love technology and we're globally connected, but when I was growing up, you never heard about suicide. In the paper, it'd be, died suddenly.
Yes.
And you weren't sure if it was a car accident or suicide. But now, I would challenge people listening to this podcast right now to go into the subscribe button and comment, and just comment me. If your life has been affected by somebody in your circle taking their life, not you personally, someone maybe you struggle or someone I bet there would be hundreds of comments because it's only increasing. And I think it's one of the frontline battles that we have to lean into as a church, because there's been not a celebration of it, but because there's been attention put on it, there are people that don't have the same coping skills that go, you know what, I want to escape.
Yeah.
And I spent 2 years traveling full time. And the number one call I would do for be depression. And I'd say, it's more than just a bad day. It's more than just sadness. It's like a darkness. It's been a long time you can't escape, and you feel like you're drowning. And I'm telling you, 80% response rate. Yeah. 3,000 people, you'd have 2,000, 2,500 come to the altar. It is an epidemic in our youth right now. Yeah. And I believe for every giant, God wants to raise up Davids. That's why I really respect AJ. Even on social media, talks about I'm having a bad day mentally, and it's not venting. It's like a healthy vulnerability, but he's leading through it. I think as leaders, we need to have these conversations.
Yeah.
This podcast wouldn't have happened 5 years ago.
I think though, to have that, to flip the lights on though, that this is a spiritual conversation too. And like, there's a difference between depression and oppression, right? And like, there's the depression component that we do all agree that there's a physiological thing there. There is also that kind of darkness that I believe is a spiritual thing, and that needs to be battled in its own right. Not just I need to take my meds. I also need to have the mind of Christ. I need to know how to actually recognize the spirits. And I think suicide ultimately is the enemy having his way with someone. Like, he is trying to destroy people. Yeah. And that is such a, we had a service a couple months ago, and we sometimes will do these prayer times. and we'll just say, hey, we're praying for these things today. If anybody's feeling this, just put your hand up and we'll gather around you and we'll pray over that. And we got praying, and God kind of prompted me to pray for just for people who are suicidal, and you could feel it in the room. Like you could feel the spiritual shift. Like God was doing work, and there were spirits at play that God was like, I want after that. And I think you're bang on. Like, I think the church needs to really approach this conversation from a spiritual standpoint.
And take it even further is like, I love social media. Follow me on social media. It's AJ Thomas at,
you're a good follow on Instagram, legit.
I love it. I do. Like, I'm not that guy going technology, but I do love it. But what's happened now, it's like Castaway the movie. It's like you're dying of thirst, but you're surrounded by salt water. Yes. And what happens is it gives the illusion of connection, but it's isolation. When I was growing up, you knew who your friends were because you'd see their bikes on someone's lawn. Or you go to school school Monday morning, and there was a pool party on the weekend. Oh, cool. Now people in live time are seeing things they're missing out on.
Yeah, I'm not there.
And it gives the illusion of connection. Like, friends would be like, yeah, who'd you hang out with? Oh, this guy on Friday night. But they're actually in their own home, online, playing Fortnite, and they were with their buddies, but not in the same room. Yeah. Statistics and science has proven, you take a newborn who is intensive care, they say the mother or father needs to touch that baby through the incubator, because if it doesn't get human touch, it'll die. Prisoners, it's torture. Solitary confinement, it's in prisoner of war camps. They put them alone, they go mentally crazy. Yes. The problem is we are alone, but we think it's like the Matrix. We think we're with people all the time, texting we're with each other, but we're on our phones. Yeah. And I believe we are surrounded by water we're drinking, but it's killing us. We're starving for connection. That's why local church matters. Yeah. There's something about being in the same room, slapping a guy on the arm, being a little sarcastic, being spiritual, being real, playing basketball, going out and having wing night together. There's something chemically God made us. Yeah. Isn't it interesting that Adam was with God in the garden? He walked with him. The Trinity was with Adam, and God says, not good for man to be alone. Yeah. He wasn't alone. He had God. Yeah. God's not enough for man. Yeah. He said you need a woman. Yeah. You need companionship. Yeah. I believe a part of this is linked to we've never become more isolated. I've never seen suicide spike and depression. Yeah. I believe some of it could be hormonal and food and all that stuff.
It's got to be linked.
But I do believe it's community is a part of the solution moving forward. 100%. Real community, not just online. Yeah. I believe that.
I want to circle back to what you were saying, Brent, about the spiritual component of suicide and mental illness in general. That I think there's two errors we can make when we're thinking about this, and one is to make it only spiritual. Right. Or make it only physiological, right. Yes. Or make it only emotional. Right.
Or only communal, right?
Yeah. Right. Or make it all three, but because we don't have a solution to one of those, ignore the solutions we do have to the others.
Right. Body, soul, and spirit.
Sure. Right. Yeah. So for me, I think, the question of, like, for me, is depression physiological? Yes. Is depression spiritual? Yeah, at least in the sense of, like, the enemy is a jerk, right? And he'll find where you're weak.
He's squeezing on your weaknesses,
right?
For
exactly.
Sure.
And so, in the same way that someone who, is owning a nice car, is that bad, or just the case that you own a nice car? Like, sure. If you go, man, I could feed all these orphans, or I could buy a sixth nice car, then for you, owning a car has become an issue of spiritual attack in your life, right? Like, there's a greed or something there that the enemy's, or again, we talk about when you're overtired, you tend to, when you're sick, you're not at your best spiritually, and the enemy will try to capitalize on that, right?
Well, Jesus was hungry in the desert, and that's where the enemy came at him.
Exactly,
It's a natural weakness.
And so I think one of the things that's helpful is to go, my depression in and of itself likely isn't a statement of my spiritual weakness in terms of distance from God, but it is a place of weakness in my life. Right. And the enemy will absolutely capitalize on that. Yep. And so you can't say I'm a terrible Christian because I'm mentally ill. Right. But you also can't say I'm mentally ill That's just how that is, and I can leave that on a shelf somewhere and not worry about it. It's. I mean, I don't know how far in the ditch we can go on this podcast.
Hey, the purpose of this podcast is for wide ditches. So.
Well, okay, so
I may regret that statement.
Yeah, you're gonna. But I mean, if you're gearing up to play some sort of contact sport, at least as a guy, there's certain areas you protect all the more.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Because
I'm not following you. Which areas?
Well, I'm not surprised. So I think it's that same thing, is to go like, this is an area of, again, not weakness in terms of character. Like, one of the things I always say is like depression, anxiety, they're weaknesses, or their illnesses, not weaknesses, in the sense of, it's not a lack of character. It's not a lack of love for the Lord. Right. It's not necessarily I mean, you could have all those things and be mentally ill, but those are related but different issues, right? But so I know I've hear people say stuff like, I think there's an attack of the enemy. I'm like, I think it could be both. Like, I think this could be a weak point in you that the enemy is attacking, and it could just be the enemy. And but you know what I mean? But that's like, the devil's a jerk. He always goes for those things. So whatever your weak point is, whatever your low point is, whatever place he thinks he can worm in access, wherever your defenses are low, that's where he's going for. Yeah. When it comes to suicide, I mean, I want to just echo what you said, Brent, about, I think there are many situations where it is an unaccountable action because of the mental state someone is in. But at the same time, even if it is a fully morally accountable thing, I don't think that, I'm as Wesleyan as they come, as Arminian as they come, but I don't think we lose our salvation in that sense. Yeah. I think you can give it back. Yes. And I think if the sin you committed before the bus hit you was saying, God, I don't believe in you and don't want your love in my life and take your grace away, that's sure. I don't want to be you. But I think God's grace is sufficient for that. But I think I've never been to the point of legitimately being suicidal. But I have absolutely been to the place where I see how it makes sense. Right. And I think we need to be, if I can, in a way that is kind of being a jerk, Mike, if I can push back to describe mental illness to someone as a temporary problem is super harsh. Because it's not temporary to them. It's all day, every day. Right. It has been for months or years. And so it's not the same thing as my girlfriend dumped me and I got to get through that, or I lost my job.
And my thing was suicide itself. Not
it's
mental
a temporary
illness, problem.
It's an eternal solution to a temporary problem.
And well, it is. But I'm saying they don't see it that way.
Sure, of course not.
To them, it's the only solution to a permanent problem. And I think we got to approach that with all the compassion in the world. And I think if you're talking to someone who's suicidal, again, it's suicide, and I don't mean in a way that they're not thinking clearly. They're thinking the same way someone who has, if you had a terminal illness that caused you just incredible pain, like your bones just constantly were aching all over. Let's be honest, whatever you think about euthanasia, all of us would be going, I wish there was a way out of this, even if that was it. Sure. And it's that, but for your head, right? And so I think you just we have to go slowly with people and help them to realize
we do.
Suicide isn't gonna fix. This is what I usually tell people. Suicide is not going to take away the pain. It's just going to transfer it. Mm-hmm. It's going to take the pain you feel and put it on other people.
And that's what I'm going.
And it's going to last. It's going to last longer for them.
In my extended community, we have people living through, a young man that was just struggling, and now the pain is now passed on. Yeah. That's why I think it's so important, this podcast, but even your leadership is going, hey, it's not just I'm preaching from an opinion. I'm walking through this. Let me teach you what I'm learning in my journey. That's what I love. It's a whole walk alongside. We don't know how we're getting there yet, but we're committed to do it together.
Yeah. My whole angle on my message was agreed. When you're suicidal, it feels eternal. This is not temporary. It's always going to feel this way. Mm-hmm. And the thing I told our church was, you can't trust how you think.
No, absolutely.
And that doesn't just go for the suicidal person. As believers, we are fundamentally resigning our mind to the mind of Christ. We actually have to start to learn how to think with the gospel. Yeah. So I measure what is temporary based on the gospel, not how I feel, right?
Yeah,
so,
no, absolutely.
So, I mean, I think the gospel equips us to, I would say all the more for the mentally ill is like, I just have to like run. I think that's what Paul was getting at in 2 Corinthians 10:5. He says, you know, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal in nature. So it's not even about, you know, your feeling. It's not about your body. It's about, you know, we tear down strongholds and every lofty argument that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we do that by taking it captive and make it obedient to Christ. So you run every thought through.
That's what I tell people all the time when I'm like, I wind up counseling people all the time who have mental illness stuff because they go, you have some idea what this is like. Because it's a hard thing to talk about with someone who hasn't experienced it because it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't make sense. Does that make sense? Like it doesn't make sense to you because it's not based on sense.
Right.
Right. And so you have to have somebody else who's had the same nonsensical experience to understand it. But one of the things I'll tell them is I'll say, you know, it's like if you've got a car and I've got an old car and there's like lights that come on all the time, dashboard lights. But actually I know in that car, it's the sensors usually that are the problem, not what they're actually sensing. So like my check engine light's been on for like a month and a half. I don't think there's a thing wrong with my engine. I think it's that same sensor again that last time I took it in. They went, there's a short in that sensor, right? And so one of the things I tell people when you're struggling with mental illness, it's actually not your car that has an issue. It's your sensors.
Right.
And so you've got to trust what you know to be true, not what you feel to be true, right?
And there's all these,
exactly. That's what I'm saying. Right? There's all these lights flashing in your eyes, and you've got to. I can't explain how weird it is to figure out how to not trust your own thinking,
right?
Because it's not just your feeling; it is your thinking, or it's so strong in your feeling that it bleeds over into your thinking. But I wind up feeling like Homer Simpson when he has those like his brain talks to himself things. Like, you know, it's like, don't be depressed. like it's that kind of thing where like, or like the whole world's terrible. No, the whole world's not terrible. Like it's this weird internal thing. And I think one of the things that's really valuable in that kind of anchoring yourself in what you know is true in Scripture and ignoring until such time as they align your feelings or your kind of intuitive sense of things does go back to that whole community thing and giving other people permission to say, like, to tell you that. Like, I'll sit down with people and I'll go,
like you have to fix it either.
No. I just sit down with people and I'll just say, No. You need people to talk to you to go, let me tell you how you're actually doing.
Yes.
And man, I can't tell you how often I get to do that for people.
Right.
But, you know, I'll have people who are, you know, everything's terrible and I don't know what I'm doing. It's like, tell me how many friends you have in this church that are close that you would trust with anything. Well, there's you know. All right, do you have a job? Yeah. Do you live inside? Yeah. Do you love your cat? Yeah. You know, and you go and then I go, your life is good. You're fine. Yeah. You know what I mean? And
it's like an inventory.
They need another voice, right?
Yeah, that's what I mean because you need someone. You need a. I heard this expression once. A guy said, you know, if he's talking about dealing with a family in a situation with a funeral where they didn't have faith. And he said, you know, if they don't have faith, I lend them mine. And I think that's a beautiful idea. But I think it's the same idea with like a clear mind. Like if you don't have a clear mind, borrow someone else's. Right. Like have people in your life.
Well, that's what encouragement is, lend encouragement.
Who can go, here's the objective, and we all need that at times in our life. Like when your thinking is muddled, you need an outside voice to speak into that. But if you're mentally ill, like that's the condition, your thinking is muddled, and having people who can just, you know, even if it's your spouse or whatever, who can just go like, everything's okay.
Paul is trying to say though, with taking thoughts captive, like to learn to think with the gospel, like even on basic stuff, like, okay, the gospel says I don't have the right to take my own life. It's not mine, it's his. I've bought with a price. All those things, like the gospel speaks to those things. So even if you don't have a friend, like I think it's contingent upon the church to start to teach people how to think with the gospel so that if I can't run over and talk to AJ today for him to tell me everything's okay. I need to learn how to look at the cross and let that tell me,
for sure,
hey, this is temporary. Even though it doesn't feel it, this is temporary. I fix my eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. That's eternal.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. Like as a discipleship, as a way to disciple people who have mental illness, to teach, like to help them, teach them that discipline by going, like, here's the list.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or here's the filter.
And this is true.
Here's the,
whether you feel it or not.
And so, like, I'm not Mr. Like, I don't, when I say I'm talking to people, it's after church on Sunday or if they make an appointment. Like, I'm not their person they can text at 3 in the morning. So if it's 3 in the morning,
but you'd be awake.
I would, but I'd be doing something else. If it's 3 in the morning, you can do this on your own. Like, you can walk yourself through this list, right?
So this is the thing too, is I do believe every generation has their own battles, and if you're listening to this or watching this, like, this is one of the ones we're in. I'm thankful. I've never had mental illness. I've never been suicidal, but I'll say this: I've never been more aware of my mental health than the last 13 months. And I am always kind of doing that whole, am I all right? You know, when you fall down, you're like, am I all right? Am I all right? You ever stand up, you've been sitting down too long, your legs are asleep, you're like, okay, I shouldn't walk right now. There's been times in the last year where I'm like, okay, I'm not going to walk right now and make a decision because I don't think I'm great. And I've had to I know I have friends that have erased social media from their phone, not because they're angry at somebody. It triggered something. They go, I don't think I'm okay with that. And there's other people, I'm very selfish about my mental health right now. And I've never been that way in my life. I'm 43. I've never struggled in my life. I've been through some really tough stuff in the past. My life is probably the best it's been in 15 years. And I've never struggled more with, I feel like things want to creep in. I think it is some of the battle we're in this season of world history. But I'm very selfish with my mental health of going, that makes me feel like I'm a little too far spent. And I'm just very aware. I think it's important to take inventory and to be selfish going, I need to look after me. Not in a selfish way of I'm going to do me and forget everybody else, but am I okay? And take the time. You know, Jesus died for our sins. We don't have to walk around like we have to. Right. And we don't have to die for the church. Someone said we're the sower, not the savior. Especially as leaders, we think, I just give my life. Yeah. We're the sower. Yeah. And at some point I'm like, you know what? I can't solve your problem if I'm not okay. And I've been a horrible pastor sometimes in the last 13 months because I knew if I gave one more call, one more visit, I'm in a real risky place. Maybe not suicide. It hasn't gone there. But to the point where I'm going to be in a slump I'm not going to get out of.
Right.
So I just encourage us to be more selfish than ever or more aware of how we're doing and try to read yourself. I think it's important.
Yeah. I think it's interesting you say it's been in the last 13 months, which is the time since you started Nova. Yeah. Because it is very much... it's par for the course if you're planting a church for the enemy just to pile on. Sure. And so I think that's, and
some of it's emotional, some of it's physical, and some of it's spiritual.
Well, and that's what the spiritual I think comes because you are a higher priority target now. There's more to be lost by taking you out right now than ever before. Right. More to be lost for the kingdom, I mean. Mm-hmm. And the just natural stress and pressure of what you're doing creates that weak point for him to capitalize on, right?
Super good.
And so, yeah, man, I do. I would want to make sure I say to people, like, I kind of, in some ways, have a reputation as being like the mental health guy or the mental illness guy or whatever, which is fine. But I do want to make sure, being loud and clear to say that if you got a mental health issue that's diagnosed by a doctor, treat it medically. Yeah. But don't presume that that's all there is to it, right? Yeah. And don't see it as a thing that's completely isolated from the rest. I think one of the things God's taught me through my journey is that we are so much more interconnected than we realize. And like if one of the things that's the worst for my mental health is if I have some other ache or pain, so if I got a sore foot or a bad back, or if I hurt my knee or whatever, right? Like that your messes up my mental health, right? Or the weather, like stupid things like that. It's like so
tipping
all
point kind of tips you.
Well, it's all interconnected, right? And so I think, I think we need to approach these things from all those different angles. And some of those angles, there's going to be more room to move, and others there isn't.
I think that's super helpful.
But it's not people who are mentally ill have no faith or are possessed by the devil.
Correct. Yeah.
But it's also not if you have mental health issues, then somehow that gives you a pass on the enemy attacking you, or there being sin in your life, or you needing to grow in your faith. You'd be
wise if you have mental health issues to realize that's just an easy door for the enemy.
Yeah, and it, like with anything else, right? If you find a weak area in any structure, right, or a weak piece, then you strengthen everything that's around it. Like I'm looking at a window right here. This window is a weak part of the wall.
Right.
And so there is a big thick header inside the structure of the wall, over it and under it, and thicker posts going down the side to help carry that, right? And so if you have if mental health is a weak point for you, then spiritual health and physical and relational health, those just become all the more important.
Right.
But also do what you can to address the mental health part.
Good.
Super helpful. I know we're 3 preachers and we probably could just go forever. So we did hit on technology pretty good. One thing I really want to answer, because I feel like there's some appetite out there when we talk about the suicide thing. Really quick, we're going to be done in a second, but like assisted suicide, as a believer, where do we land on that? Because let's just have some compassion first and just say there are some people who have horrible living conditions. Yeah. We now live in Canada. I was our community group we host at our house. We had this discussion. One of the ladies that's in our group's a nurse, and they do it on her floor at the regional hospital. Yeah. So it's here. People are opting to die.
Yeah. And
so where do we, as people of faith? I have an answer, but I want to kick it to you guys.
Yeah. I get it, the desire for it.
Sure.
Although I think in some ways the appetite for it is a symptom of our incredibly suffering-averse culture.
Yes.
We don't have a theology or a framework to help us see any sort of value or good in, or nobility even in suffering.
Right.
So I think that tends to inspire people maybe to look at that earlier than they should.
And call it humane.
Yeah. But I mean, even to like, there was you take every war movie you've ever seen. There's the scene where the guy's like shot and blown in half, and he's just not quite dead yet, and they put the bullet in him to put him out of his misery, to save him 20 minutes of inevitable pain and death.
Yeah.
Versus now where you got people looking at saving themselves 20 years of a lower quality of living or whatever, right? And so I think that's part of the conversation. I think, but I wouldn't want to die a horrible, painful death. I really wouldn't. And if that became inevitable, I would want to end my life, but what does what I want have to do with what I'm supposed to do?
That's
right?
the question.
Like if I lived my life the way I want, there'd be a lot of things different. Like with the way I naturally, instinctively want to.
Your wanting's part of the problem.
Right, exactly. And so I think for me, it does cross that line of like, you're taking a life, and you shouldn't take a life.
You're playing God.
And I think that although I probably, in a vacuum, like in a world where there was only me and 3 other people or whatever, could get my head around a moment where it made sense. Mm-hmm. Like that, whatever, like I just stepped on a landmine. I've been literally blown in half. I'm in absolute agony, but it's going to take me another 20 minutes to bleed out or whatever, I could get my head around that, maybe not as being the worst thing in the world. I think that it opens a door that's not worth opening.
Yeah.
For the 0.00001%.
We always go to the worst case scenario,
right,
too.
Where maybe you could somehow get there.
Yeah.
I think opening that door, and I'm not a slippery slope guy. Like I'm not. That's to me. I'm. If it's a slippery slope, put on cleats. But I think this is a situation where I think it does. It opens.
Yeah.
It opens it up, and I think it's gonna, it's gonna turn into some kind of new version of eugenics.
Yeah, I just don't think you're, as a believer, you fundamentally have subscribed to this fact that I believe in God, mm-hmm. and God decided when I would be alive.
Yeah. And
He ultimately gets to decide when I'm not.
Yeah.
And I also believe in a God who demonstrated the fact that He brings meaning to suffering.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also think that we have lost a view of eternity. We have put ourselves at the center of this story, and it goes counter to our culture, but we are just a page in a larger chapter in a larger book.
Right.
And we're not the main character of the story.
Yeah.
And when we do that, we put ourselves, it's about me. And again, I've not been there. God, I hope I'm not there. I have more compassion the older I get in a lot of things. People struggle with a lot of things. I just think eternity is a long time.
Yes.
We don't preach about eternity. We don't think about eternity. This is just a moment. And Hebrews 11 is all about people that didn't cut suffering short, but leaned into it.
They died
and
in
said,
it.
This is my lot, and I will run with it.
Yeah.
And again, I've not been there. I have compassion, but I just think we are a vapor of breath in a larger thing. And we have to get our mind. That helps my stress level. Mm-hmm. That helps me thinking that my church is really, really important. Yeah. That helps me thinking that it really matters. All the other things. It's just a blip. Yes. We are not the center of the story.
You're a vapor.
We're not.
Huge. Yeah. So we hit most of the things I wanted to. Let me do this as a kind of final outtake. We kind of talked technology a little bit in there, and it kind of wove over the mental illness. Give me one. If you give one word of advice to our listeners about social media, here's a hack for healthy social media consumption or usage as a believer. What's it going to be?
You don't need to be polite on social media as far as afraid of unfollowing or following, meaning there's some people thinking we've ruined the word friendships, like, I can't unfriend somebody. I believe, again, to protect your mental health, your being, it is if something you see, it's not them, maybe they're completely right, but it's triggering either jealousy or comparison or even just distraction, I believe you need to protect yourself and don't apologize for unfollowing. I've unfollowed people like, you don't follow me anymore. I'm like, yeah, I don't need to give you a reason for that. It's not you. It might be me. Yeah. At the other time, let me say a positive side of it. We've never had a chance to be mentored by amazing men and women that we may never get a chance to have coffee with and get a real glimpse that those that do it well and authentic of struggles and wins and what a time to be alive. I call it Frankenstein mentoring, where it's the head of one person, the arm of another, where I can glean from world-class leaders like a Brian Houston, and other people and get a bit, what a time to be able to get information for the assignment on our life. As the pace picks up, we can learn at a faster rate. And I think it's fun and have fun with it and do your life. And if you post thinking someone else, what they're going to think of it, not in a responsible way, but in, I hope value. They like it. Or if you go to it for your source for anything, if it causes a reaction inside of you, step away from it.
Yes.
I think it's supposed to be fun. Have fun with it. Don't overthink it. But do know that what you reward, you'll reproduce. Yeah. And be very mindful of it. But I think what a great learning tool, and I celebrate it in moderation.
You follow the Mike Miller, right? It's the Mike Miller.
Real Mike Miller.
Real Mike Miller.
Not the fake Mike Miller, real Mike Miller.
Real Mike Miller on Instagram. Really. Are you on Twitter? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We don't tweet as much.
There's only me and AJ are only left on Twitter.
Actually, AJ's only on Twitter.
I left Twitter months ago.
Oh, really? That shows you how much I'm on it.
I unfollowed him.
I'm only on Facebook, but some of us don't have personal profiles on there. We're only public personas.
I have my face in the book.
Here's a fun fact. The reason I went to the public figure thing was exactly this, though. It was I can't keep up with this. I'm having access. So really, I'm a public,
negative. That's why I went public.
I'm a public figure on Facebook, not because I think I have
very anti-Atlantic Canadian.
I totally get how that sounds. The reason I did that is I want to use that as a ministry tool. It's a billboard. It's a one-way conversation. To all my great King's Church people who message me on Facebook, I don't get it. Yep. So and that's just, it's not a channel for me.
Yeah. My advice. I mean, kind of few overlapping things. One for me at least that I find helpful is if it's not fun, stop. Like if you get to the point where you're having pointless arguments or trying to defend stuff that. You're having a conversation on there that you wouldn't have in real life, like that kind of thing. Like it's just nitpicky or fighty or like there's no obligation. Like there's no law in the universe that says you have to be engaged on social media. And so if at some point it becomes discouraging or stressful or frustrating, just don't. Yeah. Like it's not a requirement for life. It's to me, it's like if you're watching a movie and it's boring, you shut it off. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like you don't have to finish
You're
Facebook.
Not obligated to it.
Yeah. I have a rule in our church, an unwritten rule that if someone starts with, I saw on social media, I'm like, okay, I'm not taking this serious. Because I've had people say, my kids weren't invited to your kid's birthday party. I saw it on social media. I'm like, no, that wasn't a church event. That was my kid's event. Or why wasn't I invited? No, that's we're not going to live in that world. Yeah. It's been the cause of a lot of things. Yeah. And so it has to be fun. Yeah. Or if it causes a reaction, you got to look at that.
I try not to connect with people on social media. To me, social media is a method of efficiently keeping up with people I would really like to keep up with in real life.
Right.
And so like, you guys would be examples of that, and I've got like pastor friends from far-flung places who, like that's the best way for me to, I just, don't have the time and the bandwidth to like text each one of them individually.
Right. Oh, just they celebrate their anniversary in Mexico. Really cool.
Or hey, this is a new thing they're doing. That's cool, or whatever. Right. And so for me, like I'm not trying to build followers. I don't have, for me personally, this is probably irrelevant to most of the audience, but as a pastor, I'm not friends with anyone on Facebook who goes to my church.
Huh.
Just like not even my staff.
Yeah.
Cause like if you want to talk to me,
come to me.
Yeah. Like, and so it's either people who, mostly it's people who don't live in the same city as I do, or it's people who live in the same city, but our circles are different enough that I wouldn't bump into them otherwise.
The point is, you use social media. You don't let social media use you.
Totally. Yeah. It's how I connect with the people I want to connect with.
Right.
And then the other the other thing I would say about it,
I'm not the only one hearing that, right?
Is you're not having a stroke. The other thing I would say about it, is you don't owe people, sort of like you said, you don't owe people engagement there.
Yeah.
And so if someone sends you a private message, you get to it when you get to it.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to stop in the middle of supper to answer it, or you don't have to not, like, to me, it's just it's not real, in the sense of like, if someone this is why I don't follow anyone from my church, so they can't send me messages. But if someone sends me a message via Facebook, that's not on my list of people I need to get back to. I probably will eventually, but not in the same way as if someone calls my office or sends me an email at work. Like, to me, that's that's someone I should acknowledge at least that they've contacted me.
I don't follow my own father on Instagram.
AJ is notorious for the greatest auto respond emails. Like, you know how you can set your email to do auto respond? Some of his are legendary. Like, hi, I'm currently on vacation, and he describes what he's doing.
I don't care about your message.
I'm having more fun than you.
Yeah. Guys,
my pants don't have a button because I'm on vacation.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah,
it's been super helpful, and I know the people, not just the King's Church, but the extended, online family who will watch this will really be helped. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time. And if you made it to the whole end of this hour and a half, probably
I will now show you my belly. No, just kidding. Thanks for having us on, man.
Yeah.
And we love King's Church, and we love what you guys are doing in our region. And it's a huge encouragement to the broader community. Awesome. And so legit to the King's Church family, thanks for the way you help set the pace in Atlantic Canada.
Awesome. Our privilege. That's a wrap. Listen to this. Listen
That's what Freddie Prinze would have heard his whole life.
When you close it. No.
Awesome.
Beautiful. Thanks, guys.
That was fun.
Thank you.
Woo.